everybody, and thanks for visiting. This is Jack Curran. I'm a black and white landscape photographer. And in this particular video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a lot of the tools and techniques that I use in Lightroom. We'll look at some of the shortcuts. We'll look at some of the tools that I use on a regular basis and some of the techniques that I use as well. And that way, when you go through some of my either YouTube videos or my long form videos, which are the more in-depth tutorial videos that I have in my Master of Light series, you'll at least know some of the techniques or can reference back to this. We'll go through them as we go through all the videos, but they're really a good, this will be a really good format for shortcuts back to some of the techniques that I use. Over the course of the next, 8-9 months, here's, 100 or so images that I'll be going through for some of my short form YouTube channel tutorials and short form videos. And then once we get into some of the longer, more detailed things, we'll be going through 40 or 50 of these longer, harder, more detailed, intense techniques on the long form Master of Light series videos. So thanks for showing up, and I really appreciate it. And we may as well just kind of rock and roll and get started. All right. Okay, so here we go. And one of the first things that I like to do when I get into any of the images that I work is a combination of resetting the camera profile and using the histogram to kind of look at things. So we're in the develop module here. We're going to go down and we're going to find the camera profile, and I will always click remove chromatic aberration because that leaves a little artifact edge between green and blue or some color tones and stuff like that, that if you get rid of that right away, sometimes that'll help you with your edge sharpening and you won't get halations as much. Then the other thing that I'll do, and you really can't see it, but you can see the middle of this image kind of popping out, and that has a lot to do with whatever the elements are in the lens and the profiles for the lens, and Lightroom has a set of corrections for that. So I'll usually take a look at that. If I like it, I'll go ahead and change that, and then you can also go down and see your specific information. So if we go back up here and we look at the histogram on this one, you can see that everything is jammed all the way over here in the highlights, right? So you can either drag it both ways, and see what you can do here. And if you want to, when we look at this black and white version, you'll see where I've kind of taken this. So I just want to go back to this. We're not going to do any of the tutorial editing here, but we're just going to kind of go through the histogram. You can also click these up here and you'll see where there's clipping. So now that'll start showing up. You see the white starting to show up. That's where there's absolutely no detail in the highlights. And this one we can't really, but if I were to take it a little darker, you can see where the blacks start to show up, and there's absolutely no detail in the blacks. So that's when you're going to start seeing some clipping. So I think I'm going to try another image and go up here, and there you'll see some clipping down here in the black, and I've got that. The other thing that you can do is you can just hover over these and it'll show up. There's not much clipping going on here in the white. So one thing I do want to show you real quick when we're looking at this, you can hit the J key as well, and that will show you the clipping. So that's kind of a shortcut to take a look at clipping. I'm going to pump the highlights up here. I'm going to click this, pump the highlights up real quick. Let's see if I can get that to clip. Now you can see where those are all blown out, right? And I'm going to go back and I'll correct this in the histogram. But so now I've got clipping in the shadows and the highlights. What I can do sometimes, and what I'll do in some of the tutorials, is I'll take the adjustment brush and I'll go just into these areas and I'll reset this, the adjustment brush, by double clicking the effect to 0, and that resets the entire palette. And then I will go in and I'll take my white down and my highlights down, and I can paint that out so that now my blown out whites are not quite the same. Then I'll get a new brush, I'll reset that, I'll go in and I will open up my shadows a little bit. Let's see if that's doing it. Maybe a tad of exposure and just a smidge of black. And then I can go in there and paint back the detail that was missing down there before. And once I paint over some of that area, I can open that up. Sometimes I really want the, that's kind of overcompensating and affecting it because I have the exposure up. Then I can still use just the dark of the shadow and just see I can move just the shadows and not the highlights. So that's basically what I will do with the camera profile and the histogram a little bit. I didn't really get into a lot more detail in the histogram. Let me just, I'm going to Command Z, I'll go back to the history panel and you know, see where we were. And we were kind of in this range, but I'm going to go ahead and unclick those. I can go back on this one and I can look at the raw file and again see that I'm stacked in the middle. And what I can do here is I can take the exposure and I can start playing with contrast and start moving some things, moving the colors. Sorry, I got this still open. But I can start moving the exposure, you know, start increasing the shadows. And that's going to start spreading it out. I can do the same thing down here with the tone curve. And then pulling it down. And that starts evening it out a little bit. So you can start seeing how that's starting to work. So you can play with a histogram, but those are a couple of things that I'll start with right away on any of the tutorials. So I hope that helps. That's one of the first things that we'll talk about. Okay, real quickly, I want to just share with you a couple of things. Like when you're working on a file and you screw it up, and I screw them up all the time, or want to go backwards and fix something that I've already done. There's a couple different ways to do that, and you know, one is obviously you can go to your history panel over here in the navigator section. I'm going to close the presets and the snapshots and go to history. And you can go down here and you can look at different things, but you can go backwards throughout the history panel here, right? So there I was underexposed, then I put the exposure back in, or I can go all the way back to create a virtual copy, which takes me back to the beginning. And that is one of the things that I like to do a lot. Throughout the process, I will save various stages. So I'm going to go photo, create a virtual copy, or you can do the command key with a little hash or a comma, and that will make a virtual copy as well. But I'll create a virtual copy, and then I might just say, you know what, I'm going to close this real quick. I really want one just a little bit lighter, and then I'm going to go in and I'm just going to hit that double effect, and I'm just going to darken the sky. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to, you know, lighten this mountain range back up in here. And then I'm going to go ahead and save that. So I'm going to make another virtual copy. And then I'm going to go on from there, right? So I might decide that number 4, number 5, number 6, back to my original, and decide which one of those I like. I may then also go in here and select them, go back to my library, or you know, and just do a Y key and start comparing them, you know, different things. So, but I really want you to think about making several virtual copies as you go, or using the histogram, or if you're in there, if you're in one of the files and you've done a lot of work on it, and you go back in here and you make a big move. So say you open that up, you hit the double effect, just double tap effect, and that will reset those bars to 0 and take away what you just did. Okay? Well, I hope that helps a little bit as well. And I do that quite a bit because it's a process. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit about how when I first open up a raw image, I do some previewing via the exposure control. And I think this is really helpful. it helps me also for when I go out in the field. I start to think about what are the darkest shadows, what are the highlights, what can I hold, where should my exposure be. But when I get back into Lightroom and I'm in the develop module, I've kind of got everything reset at 0, but what I want to show you is how I kind of look at things to start with. So what I will do is I'll take the exposure way down, and I'll look at, when I take it way down, I'm going to look at how much detail is still in the shadows down through here. Where are some of my spotlights of actual light? So you can see there's these areas here, there's these highlighted areas right here, right along this edge, a little bit of the snow, and I see some detail down here. So I know that I can, if I go back and I darken the image and then bring those areas back up, I'm going to have a contrast range that's going to give me a little bit more of a dynamic range, and it's going to pop more. I can do the same thing with the highlights. So I'll open them up and I'll start to see, okay, all this is blown out, but I see a little bit of tonality in here. I see a little tonality in here. Now I get to see how much opening I have in the highlight areas here. And then I can also see there's some areas that are kind of blown out. So I will look at that. I might sometimes look at just the whites to see where they kind of go as far as the contrast range. And then if I pull the blacks down, and then I use the exposure, I can really see the intensity in some of the highlights, right? So now I'm using this to kind of give me the exposure control, and I know that there are certain areas, now you can see that separation up in the sky with the clouds and how much range of light and intensity that I can get out of that when I go back to work on that. So that's why I end up in some of these areas up here, you know, where now I've got that cloud that's all separated up there, right? So let me just go back here. I'm going to reset that real quick. And it helps me understand what I can do as far as the shadows and the highlights. So using the exposure tool to preview the highlights and the shadows and going back and maybe taking the white slider, the black slider, and really looking at that and trying to understand the dynamic range before I even convert an image will help me understand that. And it's also helped me when I'm looking at a scene out in the field to think about shadows and highlights and dynamic range, tonality, and things like that. So don't be afraid to take this, and before you do anything with your thing, do a simple conversion. Just go in there and blast through some of the highlights and the exposure and really take a peek at it. You know, just tone it down, pump the contrast, whack the highlights out, just really see what's there. So that'll help you kind of understand what the range of light is that you have to work with. All right, that's a good one. So I've gone back and looked at a lot of the recordings that I've done for this tools and techniques, and one that I think that is really important that I want to talk a little bit about is it's more of vision, but then again it's going to be about transitions and using your tools and techniques to help you identify and bring out transitions within the scene. And what I mean by transitions is front to back, how the light flows across the scene, how there's, you know, contrast in the foreground and softness in the background, and different layers and techniques that you can build for the eye to transition through a scene, whether it's left to right, top to bottom, a transition between something that has a lot of tension with a storm and then a softness in the bottom, or whatever it might be, but transitions throughout the scene so that there's something interesting for the eye to see. And then also about luminosity, not luminance, because if you just take a regular image and it has luminance across the scene, that's wonderful. But if you want luminosity, it means that almost something has to glow out of the scene that really brings the eye to the pinnacle of what you're trying to show. So I've got this image up here. This is an image I shot many years ago. And as you can see, if you look at the image, it's pretty flat across the entire scene. What I was really attracted to was the aspens in the center of the scene, specifically the trunks of the aspens. And so I got out a very long lens. I don't know if this was with my 300 or what it was, but and so I was kind of focusing on those trees, and while I'm doing that, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, how do I just get my eye to kind of zoom in on those, and how do I get the viewer to look at those? But those are what I really want to work on. So I'm going to kind of take you through the process a little bit. I'm going to skip around a little, and we're going to go through this back and forth, but I want to show you how I got to basically this. So I'm going to do this and this. I'm going to show you these two together real quick, and just share that. But eventually, from this really flat scene to this really stark scene that has a lot more transitions and a lot more luminance. So all right, let's go ahead and keep going there, and I'll show you how I work through that. Okay, take two. Here's what we're going to try and do. I'm going to try and show you how I'm going to bring out the luminosity and transitions. If you see this scene right now, you'll notice that it is very flat. But one thing you will see is there's some trees in the foreground. There's some kind of brush back here in the background. There's a nice flow across the side of the hill with an angle and stuff like that. So I'll try and create transitions from front to back to middle to back. And then I'll also try to get that center area to glow a little bit more so that I can see the aspen trees in the middle and basically the white trunks of those trees to really pop. So again, there isn't a lot of color to do conversion on, so that's not going to help me a whole lot. There's a little yellow and green in here. I could be doing that. I could work the blue to make the things whiter, but let's just do a basic black and white conversion. I'm going to quickly look at my exposure and play with that, and I have one of the techniques in here, so I'm going to look at that real quick. I'm going to take my highlights up, and I'll take my exposure down, and I'll see that these trees in the middle can certainly hold detail and glow when I want to go back to start pushing it. So I'm going to kind of go back to a nice area here, take my highlights back down. And one of the first things I've mentioned I do before is I like to darken the edges and stuff with a radial filter. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to reset the effect here. I'm going to invert this, and then I'm going to take all the background down. So that's the first step in getting whatever you want to kind of have a little bit of luminosity. Again, I'm going to not play with the contrast too much. I could take that down just a smidge more. I'm still holding detail down here. I think that filter is just a little too big, so I'm going to make that a little smaller. Move it down here. I'm holding detail here, and holding detail in the corners. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now I'm going to get a reverse of one, and I'm going to do another one, and I'm angling it, and I'm going to put it in the middle. I'm going to spread it a little bit. I'm going to reset it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look for pulling some of the highlights out in there, adding a little contrast. And then I'll add some clarity in there. Now, well, watch what happens when you work the clarity. You can see it kind of getting a little bit denser. You can also do this, but that's going to really, if you use the dehaze, it's going to really pop it. So I'm not going to do much of that right now. Do the same thing by using black in there. All right, so I'm getting a little bit better. I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the overall real quick here. I'm going to pump my highlights a little, or my lights, and then my highlights down here, and you'll see the tone curve changing. I'm going to start bringing down the middle, and I don't think that's helping me as much as taking the bottom end of the tone curve, which is the shadows, and that's starting to help me a little bit there. All right, so now I've got this nice kind of curve going. I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to just look at the whites. Now you can see I'm going to tick those so you can see where those masks are, where my blacks are too black and my highlights are too high. You can see them in the trunks here, but I will fix that later. Okay, so now I've already started to create a certain amount of glow. I've got separation down here. Now what I want to do is I want to increase that separation a little bit. So this tree is just a little distracting down here. I'm going to double click effect. I'm going to pull that back down just a little. turn it a little, and then I'm going to double click that, and then I think I'll just take the highlights down and the whites so that they're not, and just maybe a little bit of exposure. I'm going to do this the same down here in this edge. Just take my highlights down, my whites down, and a little bit of exposure, but enough to still have some detail there. And then over here, I'm going to use another radial real quick. I'm going to do the same kind of thing here. Just going to pull this down just a little. And then I'm going to move it down a little so it's closer towards the bottom. I really need this to have some tone in it so that it has some depth and helps me with the transition through the scene. There's another area here that I actually like very much, and it's these trees here that have no leaves. So let me reset that and add contrast to that, and then pump up the whites and the highlights, and then I want to watch a little bit of shadow in there and maybe a little clarity to give it some mid-tone edge separation. Now those are popping out a little bit. I'm going to carry it over, turn it down, move it over here a little so it's not so much in those other trees, but it picks up more of this area over here, bottom of this a little bit. And I'm going to go back here, and I want just a little bit of detail here. But I got to keep it out of the treetops just a little. So I want just a little bit over there, right? Now I'm going to take an adjustment brush, and I'm going to just hit these treetops. Let me reset this. You won't see anything happening here for a minute. I'm just going to take that. I'm going to add a little contrast to it. It'll go dark at first. Pop the highlights, pop the white. And it's actually looking a little muddy, so let's try clarity. And I can open it up just a little. So I don't know if it's helping me or if it's hurting me there, but now you can see that I've kind of got this scene. I think it needs just a little crop off the side here to center it up a little bit. Maybe a little off the bottom, get rid of that distracting branch down there. I could tighten it up a little bit more on the sides. Anyway, so that's a little closer. Now it's not going to be as intense as, say, this one or this one, but a real quick example of, you know, now I'm going to go back to my master. I'm going to maybe pull the exposure down a little bit. Take a look at it. I also want to take a quick look at this little glow up here, because now it'll look like the light is hitting that as well. Okay, so it hit these trees, it hit these trees up here, it hit these trees down here, and I've got a little bit more interest going on. So I've got a little bit of foreground, then I have a transition to the middle tones, then another transition up high, then another dark spot, and then another light spot. So I have transitions for the eyes to flow through the scene, and now I have luminosity in here. I'm going to go back, I'm going to click these, I'll take a look at this, and sometimes what I'll do, and I mentioned this before, is if I know I have an area where I'm just out of things here, I'll go back with an adjustment brush and I'll just clean up some of those areas so that there's a little bit of detail in those shadows. Sometimes I want pure black, sometimes I don't, but I'll clean those up, go new brush, and then I'll take my pure whites down a little. I'll look for those areas in the trees and stuff like that, and just pop those down real quick. There's exposure, but you can see now I'm kind of in range, but you have to do that rather delicately. Anyway, that's a good example of trying to get luminosity out of there. Again, so if you look at, we'll do a Y key, that's a before after, and now you can see the difference here. Let me get rid of the tab key here, and you can kind of see where we are. All right, so that's before after. one thing I want to do real quick, get rid of this, turn this off. Sorry. And then we'll quickly do lights out, and you can kind of see where we're going. Okay. Whoopsie. Let's get back in here. L. Go to library. And there you have it. The final image, a little bit quick, but it has luminosity and it has transitions. So, and that's kind of the way I envisioned it when I was out there shooting it. So there you go. All right. Onward to the next one. Okay, really quickly I want to show you one other thing that I occasionally use, and you might see this in some of the video tutorials as well, but this is really using the Option key, excuse me, and wanting to see what's going on with the highlights and the shadows and stuff like that. So I'll press the Option key, then I'll go down here to the shadows, and if I do that, I can slide it back and forth. You can see the shadows kind of increasing. That's really giving me blacks down there and the things. Or if I want to open up the shadows, I can do this. Now, the same effect while you're looking at the image, but you don't really know where it is. You can see your histogram moving back and forth as well. You could move that a little as if you wanted to, but the Option key, and I'm sorry, shadows, moving that back and forth, you know, leaving your blacks. You can do the same thing down here with your Option key. I mean, these are going to be your deepest, darkest blacks. Again, I'm going to take that off. And sometimes you want to just open up the blacks so that they're not quite as dark. And the other option, again, is to use a brush and selectively go in there. If you hit the J key, you're going to see the clipping. You can go back in with a brush. Going to open up just the black, and you can go down there and start painting some of that out if you want. Right? And just the deepest blacks. And then maybe go back and put a little back in if you want, wherever you want it specifically. So again, that really helps you with the Option key, and you do the same thing with the highlights. You can look at the highlights. You know, if we look at the whites here, we can, oh, boom, here they go. Now, when we look at it, you're going to see it's completely blown out, right? So the whites are going to affect a wide range of highlights. The highlight tool by itself is just going to go into specific areas down in here. So again, I've got that clip turned on. I don't really see a lot of clipping in the highlights right now, but if I were to crank this up, then crank this up, you're going to start seeing the red come in. And if you wanted to get rid of that, you would double click this, whites and highlights down, and maybe just brush that area right there until it's gone. So using the Option key to see kind of what level of different things are happening is a really good idea. So that's another little trick that I'll use occasionally in some of the video tutorials. All right. Okay, now here's a couple of more shortcuts that I use on a regular basis. If we go up here to Tools, you'll see the first one is Crop. So you can hit the R key here, and that will give you your crop grid. If you now hit the O key, you can circle or kind of go through a series of variants on the crop grid, and these different things like rules of thirds, and this one is more about the flow and highlighting a certain area and how the light might track through a scene. You can kind of see, you know, this one's really about flow. This one's kind of interesting because it gives you variants on different crops. Like 4x5 is the same as the old 4x5 negatives and transparencies that would be shot years and years ago, but it also is a common size, and it, you know, when you translate to a larger size like 16x20 or 20x24, those are the same kind of formats. So you can circle through all that. And so let's say that we also, I just want to go through, like here's a basic one. One other thing I want to show you here about the crop grid is you can take this angle tool right here, And if you were to have a horizon line, I'm not sure that this is the best image for a horizon line here, and I'm not sure that I have one down here in the thing, but I'm just going to show you this. But you could drag this over, and if you wanted to straighten it a different way, as opposed to just grabbing the corners or getting that little arrow tool and turning it, right, you can grab the angle tool and change the angle that way. So of course that's, you know, out of whack just a little bit. You can also go in here and you can look at the crop tool and you can crop a shot. You can use custom numbers in here if you wanted to add custom numbers. Unlock that. You can type in custom numbers, enter custom right here, put in whatever size that you want, and or you can go to specific crops that are already here. And these things, the ones that are nice here, really, these are the ones that you'll work with the most on screens. Enter custom, different sizes here. You can also save out some stuff in your regular preferences as well. You can constrain the image so that if you move one thing, the other angle or the other side or aspect ratio will stay consistent so that you know it's shot as intended, stuff like that. So that's a little bit about the crop tool and one of the shortcuts that I'll use on occasion throughout the video tutorials. Thanks. We're coming back in a minute. Okay, already it's time for a little chai tea. Great. So one of the other tools that I use quite a bit that I wish I didn't have to use as much is the Q. Let's go up here, the tools. If you look at it, the Q is the spot removal. So we'll go down here, we'll hit Q. Oops, it was already open. But then you can see all the pins where things might have been used for spots. So, you know, and then you can go in here and you can do different things with your spot removal. You can use clone or heal. Heal will do a little bit nicer job on some things, and then clone will do a very specific job edge to edge. You can set your feather and you can set your opacity. And sometimes, you know, when I am cloning something or healing it, I'm going to get in there, and there's a couple of little things in here. Okay, it just sharpened up a little bit, but I may want to like clone this out, but I may want to only use it at an opacity that just barely changes it, or I might want to build it up. So you'll see me do some of that sometimes when I'm trying to match an area or blend something in a little bit differently. So that's really, you know, the clone and heal brush. You'll see that throughout some of the tutorials, but that is usually for something for me, unless there's something really distracting in the middle of the image that I have to take out. I'll work on that, and then it's just mostly cleanup. All right, let's see. What do we have next? Okay, so the next one that I use quite a bit is the graduated filter or the graduated tool. So that is M on your keyboard. So let's just do that real quick and I'll show you some. So there's M, and then you can go ahead and drag it, and I'm going to raise that exposure up quite a bit. And you know, you can move it, and if you want to see the mask on there, generally you can just hold that over there and you can see your mask. You can set it to show the mask all the time and do different things. So again, that's a little bit about the graduated filter. It's Command M. Now, one thing I do want to show you on this that I think is kind of important here, when you use this mask, and it's something that you might use on occasion, because what happens is if you use a graduated filter, you can see that it's going down into certain areas where, if I show this highlight, it's overlapping my mountain range in this particular one. Well, I can go back and I can take the erase brush, I'll adjust the size here, and I can go back and start pulling some of this stuff, you know, back in. And, you know, if I want my clouds to go back a little bit more darker, I can just go back and brush in certain areas, which is a really great feature because I've affected the whole area, and now I can use that erase brush to go back in and pull some detail back out where I want, or, you know, however I want to kind of affect the image. And then I've got this, you know, a little bit more glow in there, stuff like that. So I could do that, and then, or I could go back with the adjustment brush and do the same thing, but sometimes it's nice to do it on top of the graduated filter. Okay, so that's the graduated filter. There's lots of different ways to use a graduated filter to layer things and build things on top of each other, but you know, we'll be doing that throughout some of the tutorials as well. Okay, next. I think I should probably take another drink of my tea and get another jolt of caffeine. Okay, where are we going now? So now we're going to go to Tools. We're going to go look at the Radial filter, which is really Shift M. And so we're going to hit Shift M, and then we can drag that across anywhere we want. I'm going to double click Effect, and that resets it. But now we've got that open, and then we can do some adjustments in here. Again, we can hit the brush, and we can go back and specifically erase within the context of the Radial filter, which is nice. And I'm not sure what my flow and density is here, but whoopsie. I'm going to go back and bring that mountain out a little darker or something like that. So, you know, we can go in there and play a little bit and just bring this out. So I'm not really doing this very carefully, but you can see that within the context of that. I'm going to go back. Now I'm going to look at that mask on that Radial, and you can see where I've kind of affected the different areas in there. And as I move that around, you can kind of see how that works. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of that and go back to neutral. But that's a little bit about the Radial filter. I use this quite a bit, and I do a lot of layering and building and affecting contrast within certain areas. I'm going to double click that, and I'll just show you real quickly while I'm here. You know, you can punch the clarity up in here and do all kinds of different things with the Radial filter. And as we get into the specifics on some of the video tutorials, you'll see how I really use these in a lot more detail. But you know, the Shift M, and then you can just kind of drag out a Radial filter. Great. Okay, we're back, and now we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite tools real quick, and I use this quite a bit in almost every tutorial that you'll see. And I go up here to the tools, we look at this right here, it's the adjustment brush. The adjustment brush on your keyboard is K. So as we look at this, you'll see I've got some spots already up here. I probably should have corrected this. I don't think it's back to my regular image yet. But so I'm going to double click this, I'm going to close this real quick. Now when I hit the adjustment brush, I get different options here. Right, so I can go in here and I can hold these things down, and I can see my mask that I've been using. I'm going to go up here, I'm going to get a new brush, and you'll notice down here that there's an A, a B, and a erase. Those are really important, because if you do an A brush, you can go in and paint a certain way, and then you can use a B brush to kind of layer over that or do something a little bit differently. And for instance, real quick, I'm just going to go in here and do the exposure. I'm going to take it up. And then I'm going to use the erase brush. I'm going to take it back up. I'm going to go back, and I'm just going to erase that effect. Sometimes I might want to do a new brush, go in and do a big area like this and lighten it up, and then go in and erase. And I might just go erase right down in here, make a brush a little smaller, then maybe edge right there to give some depth. You know, something like that. So you can do different kinds of things with the A, B, and the erase brush. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. You'll see some of that in some of the tutorials. One thing I will show you that I think is pretty important, I'm going to get a new brush here, and then I'm going to go ahead and click and unclick this auto mask button. Now I've got my exposure up here, and I want to see if I can't show you this real quick. But when I take the auto mask off, I can go in here and I can build in this area right here to lighten, because I've got my exposure up. And you'll notice that down here in this area where the mountain was, the mountain range has gotten darker too. So the edge is not defined because the mask is turned off. So I'm going to delete that real quick. You see I've got this back. Now I'm going to hit the mask, and the mask will detect the edge, and I can go back and I can hit the same area. Now I've gotten the lightness that I wanted up here in the mountain range, or in the sky, and the mountain range right here down in this area did not get too terribly dark. I mean, it got a little bit of overflow, but for all intent and purposes, it stayed pretty dark, which left me with some nice contrast between the foreground and the background. So using the auto mask is kind of important. All right, I'm going to get rid of that. And then real quickly, I just want to share with you, everybody kind of wonders what's the difference between flow and density. And for flow, if you think about a spray painting or a spray paint can or a gun that has a spray painter, and it's like how hard you press the trigger is how much comes out, right? So you can put your flow all the way up here and just blast away, and you'll get a lot of exposure, right? So I'm going to get rid of that, and then you can take your flow down here and you can just build it a little bit at a time and a little bit slower, right? Or it comes out at a much slower rate, and you can just layer, 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 and keep layering. Now, density is a little bit different. So the density might be that I've got this cranked up here to 1.89, which it will never go past 1.89 no matter how many times I layer on top. So if I want 100% of 1.89, I'll do this, and it'll give me everything, right? And I can't get past it. Let me reset that. I'm going to go here, hit 2. I'm going to put my density down here. Now I can sit there and I can build and build and build, and no matter how many times I do this, it's a slow process to get all the way back up to 2. So it takes much longer to get there, but I can slowly build without making big radical changes. Again, let me just share this with you. I take the density up. It's building much faster now. So it's a process. I probably could have used a brighter thing to kind of share that example. So might go here to 3. My density's up all the way. That's just going to get in there and kind of blow that out. If I take my density down, I'm going to make these changes, but you can see it's taken a long time to build up. And sometimes I want that, and sometimes I want to make those moves quicker. So you'll only get to 2% of the move, or 3%, or 4%, depending on what you set the density at. So that's really important. The other thing that you can do that's really nice about any of these tools with the gradation and the range mask and is the range mask. So let me just take one of these tools. Let me open this up again. Well, I'm going to go back and I'm going to... Okay, so here's a tool that I use quite a bit when I'm working in the different radial, gradated, and adjustment brushes, and that's the range mask. So I'm going to go ahead and just set up a adjustment brush here and show you a little bit about what the tool will do. Now you'll see this in my video tutorials, in some of the long form videos when I'm really working hard on files and trying to get them to that master print file. So I'm just going to go ahead. I've got my exposure cranked up all the way. I've got the auto mask on. I've got the size I can control, but I'm just going to go ahead and paint in this area right here. You can see how it kind of got blown out white back there. Really a high-end glow. So down here below the brush panel is the range mask, and because I work primarily in black and white, I'm going to use the luminance only, because that's really what I tend to pay attention to in black and white, because we're only working in gradations of gray and not really color. So you can see that this range is wide open. That encompasses the whole area, and smoothness will affect different areas too. So I'm going to leave that right in the middle. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it down to the other end, and you can see how the glow stays behind the mountain, and the highlights are still affected, and the mountain itself is not. So what the range mask does is it goes in and it finds the different edges and tries to show the difference between highlights and shadows. It finds those edges and works the other side of them. So you can go down now, and I can go the other way, and if I go in and I move this mask a little, you can't see it very much, but you can see this mountain range getting a little lighter. Let me open it up just a little bit more. If I move it back and forth, you can just barely see it moving, but it is now just the shadows are affected a little bit more. I do it a little bit more, you'll see that now they're moving just a little bit. So I can go ahead and then I can do the sharpness with the softness, where I can get really hard, and I can vary the smoothness of it as well. But you know, I don't typically get down there in the smoother end because it tends to really soften it. Now, if there's an area where I'm trying and I've got fog in the morning or something like that, I might do that. So I'm going to get rid of this real quick, and then I'm going to go over to the Radial filter, and I'm going to show you a little bit bigger area. So now we've really blown this out. That exposure is really high. I'm going to go back to my range mask. I'm going to look at the luminance, and now I'm going to take it all the way down the other end. And you can see that by not affecting the shadows, I brought that whole mountain range back there. And you can see where it's kind of really affected the highlights and some of the midtones, but not really affecting that mountain range very much. So if I take it back the other way and I go down here, well, now it's affecting the mountains and not up here in the highlights very much. But it'll open up those midtones and stuff like that. So the range mask, using it in any different function there, you know, again, just once up here, back here, really pops the highlights, but the mountain range isn't too terribly affected. There is some overflow, but it does a really good job of affecting that. So I'm going to get rid of that real quick. And if we go up here and we use a gradated filter, you'll see that the same type, we're going to go here to the range mask, luminance, and if we move the buffers down here, you know, that's pretty intense. But now the mountains are still there. You know, again, if we wanted to go back and use our brush, we could go back in and brush some of that back in up in there and work that way. But I'm going to go back, go down here, and now you're going to see that the mountain range itself, even though I haven't brought the gradation back, if I bring the gradation down, the mountain range is highly affected. I go here, put it right in there, move it back up here, and the mountain range comes back. So you can see how it's finding the edge and doing reverses. So it's there. Those are the three different ways that I might use the range mask in some of the video tutorials. All right, great. Onward ho. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through some of the ways that I dodge and burn. And you'll see these a lot in the video tutorials. So I wanted to just kind of take you through the process. So as I go through some of the tutorials, you'll be able to reference back to this as some of the techniques and things like that. So real quickly, you know, this is kind of the final image. And what I've done here is I've kind of created this intermediate image. It's definitely not nearly as moody or anything like that. So let me just go in here. I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to get rid of that real quick. And I'm going to take, and I've clicked on, I'm going to close that. I've clicked on a radial filter. And one of the first things I like to do with some of the images that I work on is I like to darken the edges. So you'll notice I have this inverted. And then I can pull the density down. Whoops, I need to invert that. And then pull the density down, and that brings the edges all darker, which tends to keep the eye centralized to the main area of focus within the image. So in this case, this mountain range is very much here. And then I might go in and just go in and lighten this one area, add a little contrast before I dodge and burn, and kind of get it into an area that I like it. Now, here's where I get into a lot more detail. Is I'll go in and I'll take an adjustment brush. I'm going to look at this thing. I'm going to go contrast. I want to pump up the highlights, maybe the whites a little. I don't think I'm going to play with the clarity yet, but now I'm going to go back and a little exposure, and I'm going to start trying to pull out those highlights in all these different areas. Now I'm varying the adjustment, the size of my brush. These clouds are starting to pop. You'll notice down here I have my flow in the middle, my feather in the middle. Density can go up a little bit more. That'll give me a little bit more intensity in there. That might have been a little too, go bigger, soften that. I'm going to go back here and just pull out this. Now I'm going to hit I could go to a B brush or an A brush, but I'm going to do a new brush. I'm going to call that the A brush. And then I'm going to double click effect, and I'm going to start pulling the exposure down, the shadows down. I don't think I'll mess with black very much, but I might just go through some of these little areas. That flow is a little too high. I want to build. Density's a little too high. So I want to build this. I'm going to take my flow back up a little. And you'll notice that I still have that mask on, so that'll help me in the edges. I'm going to do contrast a little. And I can do clarity a little just to see what that does. I can look at dehaze, but that's really not what I want to do here, okay? I'm going to go back here, and what I am going to do is I'm going to grab another radial, double click this, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look for clarity, and then I'm going to open up that exposure a little bit. That's just too contrasty in that whole area there, so I'm not going to do that. But you'll see that that's kind of what I do with some of the brushes and the tools to start dodging and burning. You know, then I may go back in here, double click this, my exposure up, highlights, a little bit of white, and go in and start pulling out some of these areas down in here, getting them to pop, vary the size, a little bit more here, maybe some detail back over in here, pull that cloud out a little, pull some of these out up through here, get them to really start popping, maybe vary the size of the brush. So you'll see I build layers, and I slowly, I want that to kind of glow a little bit more back there behind those clouds, behind the mountain, and I'll slowly build, right? So that's dodging and burning, and that process takes a long time, and there's ways to go about that, and you build it up slowly. One thing that I will show you real quick is if you, I'm going to reset that, but if you go in here and you're working in the shadow areas, if you just lighten shadows sometimes, they get really flat. So here's where you can go in and you can put clarity in there. See how when you open up a shadow, you can put clarity in there, and what clarity will do is it will go in and it will find the midtones, and it'll look for the highlight differences and the shadow differences in the midtones, and that really helps when you're lightening shadow areas or you're working in the blacks and you're trying to open them up and pull out a little detail, to use that clarity tool to try and, you know, bring that out. You can see you can do it pretty much anywhere. You know, down here you're starting to see a little more detail come out. If I move it over here, you see a little bit, might be a little too contrasty, but you know, you can do that wherever you want. But especially helpful in the shadows. You know, I like the way this mountain range is separating over here. Now I can go back up, I can open those shadows even more, open the exposure a little more. I'm running out of clarity in there, but the nice thing about these things, and you want to be a little bit careful because you might introduce noise, is you can go back and you can just introduce clarity now back in there and pump the contrast, open up the shadows a little bit more, and a little more clarity. And what you've done now is essentially opened up and dodged and burned that while keeping the contrast and clarity in that area kind of wide open. So that's really very helpful when you're dodging and burning and doing those kinds of things. You know, you take it back over here into the middle. That's a little too contrasty. I do this area different than I do this area over here, right? So it's add, and then again, if I want to go back into the brush and I've got some areas where I've done something, I can go back and I can erase in here and start softening that up as well. So I hit the erase, go back in, just soften certain areas, maybe leave them a little bit not quite as dark or contrasty, you know. So I go over here, new brush or new radial filter, open it up, add the clarity back in, and then if I want that softness to come back out, let's see, where am I? I would take the brush part, I would erase, and then I might just hit that a little bit. Well, that actually made it a little darker than I wanted. So I could then use the range mask and do the luminance there and do some different things. But so now you kind of have a feeling for how I dodge and burn, but I build and build and build. Now we're not anywhere near this, but you'll see that I went in and I dodged this, I burned the highlights around here, and I really worked it for a long time, bringing out all the snow, you know. If you get in here and you start looking at some of my masks, you'll see the different areas that I worked. So that should give you a little bit about how I dodge and burn. Again, layer after layer after layer, tool after tool, finally getting to the final master print file. All right, let's see what else we got. Okay, so another thing that I want to share with you is a little bit about how I handle sharpening. And you'll see this in some of the tutorials, but for the most part, I do a lot of selective sharpening while I'm building my master print file. I will go in and use radial tools in certain areas, and if I'm opening a shadow and I need to get the contrast back in there, I might use the clarity brush, which tends to go in and find light and dark edges, similar to what sharpening does. So a lot of that happens through the natural process. I'm softening skies, I'm adding contrast to certain areas, which is doing some of that already. And I want to be very careful not to over sharpen while I'm going through the process. I will then also let some of the printing affect my sharpness, but I don't do a lot of overall sharpening. I do want to show you that while you are doing selective sharpening during the process, there are some basic things that you can do with the tools here. So I'm gonna create a little bit of a radial filter here. I'm going to double click this and then say, you know, sometimes I can go in and I just sharpen a simple area here. And the other thing that you want to do when you're sharpening is, if at all possible, is sharpen at 1:1. So you can see what's going on in the sharpness areas. You know, you can see these kind of little bitty pixels and stuff like that when you go in and you crank that sharpening. You know, watch what happens here. See how intense it gets? So that's why I don't do a lot of sharpening there. Now, you can go in and you can use the, when you're doing the radius and stuff like that, you can use the Option key and you can look at the amount of sharpening you're giving it. The more it turns white, the more sharpening you're giving it. The radius will give you your edges. You go down here to the detail, and now you're starting to see the detail. You can barely see the outline over here, sorry. Pull that back up. And it's starting to soften a little bit more, or it gets really hard. And then your mask, you can go in and decide how much you want to mask. And the white is the areas that are being sharpened, and the black areas are not being sharpened. So you're going to want to go in and selectively use these tools to find the best sharpening amount, effect, and things like that. Now you can do the same thing when you're going into specific areas and trying to sharpen those, but you know, I'm very selective on how I sharpen. Most of my images come in very sharp. I'll do a very minor amount of overall, and then I will go in and do selective sharpening throughout the process, and then I will also check it when I'm printing on how much sharpening, whether I leave it to however sharp the file is, or I add a little sharpening in the printing process. But those are just some basics. Sharpening is a whole nother ball game, but if I talk about some of these things in my video tutorial, that's kind of where my thought process is in a basic way on sharpening. Okay, I've been sitting here for a couple hours and I'm starting to go a little crazy. But one of the other things that I want to share with you, when I'm working in some of my video tutorials or just working on files, I like to preview them, I like to look at them, I like to look at the before and after. You know, there's lots of ways that you can do different things. You can use some of the toggle tools up here in the menu bar to go back and forth. Those are right here, in the tone curve and some of the other areas down here. And you can toggle those back and forth while you're working. But simple previews and things you can do is if you hit the tab key, you can get rid of the side menus, and that just kind of gives you a little bit better feel for the image. You know, you can also hit the L key once and that will darken everything around it. If you hit it again, that will take it to a black screen. You can go in and set your preferences for whatever tone you want that screen to be at the end of the day as well. L brings it all back again. And then if you want to, you can hit the slash key here, and that will give you the before image and the after image, right? Or if you want to see them side by side, you can hit the Y key, hit the tab key, get rid of those, and now you can see the before and after side by side. You can also scroll through different versions of before and after over here. You can go left to right, you can go side by side, you can do some other things as far as that's concerned. So there's different ways to view it and do comparisons as you go through the process. I hope you enjoyed some of these tips and how I'm working on the different processes and techniques as I go through some of the videos. But I really like this preview process. So, okay, let's see, what else? Okay, so now we've gone through quite a few of the techniques, the tools, some couple of shortcuts and stuff like that. You can always go back and use these for reference whenever you're going through any of my video tutorials. You can bounce back and forth to this and it'll just show you maybe a little bit more detail on how I do some of these things. But I should explain everything as I go on some of my Master of Light series in a lot more depth. I might be a little quicker and a little less detailed on the YouTube videos, but you know, this series will be here for anybody that wants to use it. I'll try and include it in all the videos or have it hosted where anybody can get a hold of it. All right, thanks a lot and hope you have a great day. Take care.